Good evening, Assalamu alaikum, and namaskar to everyone. So, on behalf of BASE, I, Mahmudul Hassan Dhabok, welcome you all in BASE lecture series. So, before I start, I should share something about BASE, Bengali Academia for Social Empowerment. It is a developmental organization registered as a trust by a collective of academicians, scholars, professional and other like-minded people working for community and social development. BASE has done lots of work, but I should mention some BASE works in this pandemic time. So in this lockdown periods, loss of job and also devastating impact of Amphan affected West Bengal very badly. In this time, BASE opened more than 25 community kitchen all over West Bengal for Amphan affected poor people and migrant laborer and helpless street vagabonds. It also distributed triple dry foods, medicine, and other related items. BASE has helped many migrant laborers to go back their own state. In recent time, BASE has distributed education kit for poor and first generation children for a little bit of encouragement. I must also mention that there are two offices of BASE, one at central Kolkata near Park Circus area, another near airport Koikali. So two offices of BASE are now available for the student who are coming from the districts and those who have no a place to stay for their exam or interview purposes. And also it is available for those people who are coming from emergency purposes and they have nowhere to stay. So BASE is two offices are available for them. I must say that BASE has been conducting online lecture series since last 2 months. This BASE lecture series is a part of larger activities of BASE, which would serve as a social happening, gathering knowledge from different perspective and other holistic purpose. Today we have BASE online lecture number 51, and today's topic is the crisis of citizenship in contemporary India. So I request all the participants to turn off their audio and video, and please don't share your screen. If you have any question, write it on the chat box. Now I would request Mr. Sheikh Abdul Mateen, Assistant Professor, Department of International Relations, Jadavpur University, to welcome today's speaker. Professor Mateen, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hassan. And as Mr. Hassan said, BASE has been conducting lectures from last more than 2 months, I guess. And this is lecture number 51. It's very refreshing to see Dr. Salah here today's evening. Of course, he's one of, I regard his scholarship so much, and I shared a lot of his articles to my university academia friends and all, and which is highly regarded, scholarships on communalism, on citizenship and violence. Dr. Salah is presently assistant professor at the Center for Regional Studies at University of Hyderabad. And then before joining Hyderabad, he was there at the Department of Sociology at Tejpur University, Assam, and also he served in the Delhi School of Economics, which falls under the University of Delhi. He is specialized in the field of basically on in conflicts, violence, and violence in India, migrations, borderlands, and he has published a very solid academic book on integrated communalism, violence, citizenship, and minorities in South India. This is absolutely very important contributions to the academic discourse because this book is relatively deals with an unexplored theme of conflict and violence, especially among the religious minorities, which includes both Christians and Muslims in Indian state of Kerala. And this book is also empirically and theoretically very sound, rich, ethnographic and historical. He has used both the methods, historical and ethnographic method, in order to understand, the discourse of violence, and of course, the book compares two very important fishing community, one from Marakkaya of Muslims, and Murukuvur, if I correctly pronounce it correctly, Murukuvur Christians of South of Kerala, and with huge empirical evidence, is the book presented both historical and ethnographic exploration of whole work, not only explain the especially embedded violence within the minority, but also integrates the communalism framework, and which basically minority which are at the margins. And interestingly, he was also recently, his research area also includes the debate of citizenship, especially in the recent, the entire NRC debate, and the debate of citizenship amendment bill, the CAA, and later on CAA. And he has focused shift to citizenship discourse in India, and he also served 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow at Max Planck Institute, a very prestigious institute. It's a very prestigious institute, Max Planck, at Göttingen. He was there for 2 years, and he has also published very important articles on South Asia research, journal in South Asia research, as well as contributions to Indian sociology. He was also a proud, I would say, the recipient of M.N. Srinivasa Award for Sociology. With this, I mean, enough to say about, but I don't want to waste his time between the speaker and the audience. With these few words, and with a warm welcome, I would like to request Dr. Salah to carry forward your lecture, and this is over to you, Dr. Salah.
Thank you, Abdul. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. So thank you, Abdul, for this very generous introduction. And it's a pleasure to be part of the academic activity of BASE team. And I'm very glad to hear about academic and non-academic involvement of the organization. And I thank my friend Abdul for introducing about this platform, and also giving me this wonderful opportunity to be part of the discussion group. So, as you're aware, the title of the presentation is "The Crisis of Citizenship in Contemporary India." Although it's a very general title, my reference is specifically on Assam, where I have been doing my research for last 3-4 years, especially last 2 years of postdoc on the question of migration, citizenship, and violence in the Assam state. So my examples, or more or less my reference, will be to Assam. So as we all know that past 1.5 year has been extremely sensitive to the issue of citizenship in India, primarily because of NRC and CAA, National Register of Citizens and Citizenship Amendment Act. So past 1 year, we have seen intense debate, political resistance, and violent instances across the country in the context of the new citizenship regime in India. So my focus in today's presentation is about the background history of NRC, even CAA, and the history of illegalization of citizens in Assam. So I think while it is very important to talk about the ongoing NRC issue and CAA, it's also very useful to think about what has been happening in Assam, where we have already seen NRC list is being published, and lakhs of people were excluded from the citizenship. So my exercise is not to actually engage with what was happening in the past 1 year, but to look at the recent past of Assam state and analyze some of the incidents and issues that are pertinent to the region. And this will surely help us to think about what is happening elsewhere in the country now. So I will be specifically looking at one aspect of citizenship and violence in Assam, which is about what I call as the camp life in Assam. Uh, by camp life in Assam, what I meant here is to look at the, uh, the concentration of Muslim, especially Muslim population in certain spaces, and the history of it. So, looking at this camp life involves, not only violence affected people who are, concentrated in relief camps, but also those who are detained in detention camps. And so, my field works and interviews with people who are living in both these kinds of camps actually informs what I'm presenting today. So before coming to the detail of the camp life in Assam, uh, I would like to bring the larger picture of uh, you know legality, illegality, and citizenship issue in Assam. So. Uh, if you look at the discourse on the question of migration, illegal migration in Assam, whether it is in the political discourse or academic discourse, what I call is there is something called indistinguishability assumption. The indistinguishability assumption is about the inability of the state to differentiate between the citizens and illegal migrants. So this assumption, if you look at the literature on migration in Assam, at least few prominent scholarship in Assam, you will see that Assam is presented as a perfect example of South Asian specificity of what I call as indistinguishability, because unlike Western countries where migrants are clearly separated from the citizens in terms of their rights, in terms of their visibility, in terms of their activities in those countries, in South Asia, especially in places like Assam, it is often said that it is impossible to differentiate between who is a citizen and who is an illegal migrant. So, the justification of this argument, the inability to distinguish between migrant and illegal migrant and citizen, or the indistinguishability thesis, is based upon this argument that there are so many people who have come to Assam and rest of Northeast India after 1971, after the formation of Bangladesh, and they have acquired or they have managed to procure rudimentary documents, through fraudulent means, illegally occupying the documents and then enjoying the benefit of the citizenship in the region. So, in fact, this is a predominant argument that we can see most of the academic works, political scientists, and even sociologists have been writing about it. But then this is also, am I audible, Abdul, or is it?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, fine.
So
Perfect.
this assumption you can see like largely shared in the literature on Assam. Most of the prominent scholars working on Assam, and but for me, like this argument is also in a sense is shared by the political platform, or there is a public perception that people who come and encroach the land, occupies their labor space, then enjoy the benefit of citizenship and so on. This is also part of the dominant political discourse, and there is a connection between academic and the political discourse in Assam. But then if you actually look at and my contention is that if you look at the history of illegalization process, or if you look at the history of state discourse and the bureaucratic practices in Assam, then you can also see that how citizens are actually stripped of their citizenship rights over a period of time, and or what we can call as the illegalization over a period of time. Like those who have actual citizenship are also kind of stripped off from their rights over a period of time. So this history of negating the citizenship to the people who are living in the place has a longer history, in the sense that this goes back to the discourse of illegal migration beginning from 1970s as part of Assamese subnationalist movement. So the point is, if you look at the history of migration, then it is clear that there is a very long history of migration of people from East Bengal to the current Assam region, which goes to the early colonial phase. And there has been consistent migration during the colonial period and even after India's partition. So, so the question is not necessarily about how people who have come to Assam after 1971 acquire the citizenship right. Rather, it is also about, or it is mostly about how actual citizens who were living in India before 1971, before partition or during colonial phase, are actually denied their citizenship in the name of, illegal migration. So I'm not going into the factuality of it because there has been a lot of debate about it. My interest is not to look at, how to prove that there are several citizens or how to prove that there are not citizens, but I'm interested in looking at the ground level consequence of, the discourse of illegal migration and the political processes that involved in the, illegalization in Assam. So if you look at the history of migration question in India, it cannot be completely disentangled from the, religious dimension of it. For example, there are interesting works on how those who have come to India after partition from the present-day Pakistan region are treated differently on the basis of religious identities. So scholars such as Zoya Chatterjee and Wazira Zamindas have argued that the Hindu population who came from the other side of divided India is then treated as refugees, while Muslims who wanted to come back to India, who left the country during the time of during the time of violence, were treated as migrants. So I think it's also important to engage with these categories as refugees vis-a-vis migrants, like how one section of the population is easily understood as refugees and given permission to come back, and while the other group is identified as migrants, and it became increasingly difficult for them to come back. There has been very complicated bureaucratic processes involved in the return of the Muslim migrants. So, so the point I wanted to show is that this kind of a religious difference in treating the migrants has been already there since partition, but when we look at the post-1971 scenario in Assam, I think this religious factor has been playing a crucial role. Although it is often said that the anti-foreigner movement is primarily motivated by the subnationalist politics, which has a history of any kind of anti-migration movement in Assam, or which is rooted in the backwardness of the region, political domination of the outsiders, and so on. But over a period of time, one can also clearly see that how Hindu nationalist politics has been playing a clear role in the mobilization against the Bengali-speaking population, especially Muslim community. So now, given this background, I would like to come to some of the ground realities of Muslim life in Assam, which I have been exploring through my field work. So firstly, I will deal with the camps in Assam, camps which were set up after relief camps, which were set up after instances of violence at different points in Assam in the last 20 or 30 years, or even before, since 1980s. So we know that there has been the illegal migration is not just about arguing for a space or arguing for a situation where migrants are, denied to enter. But illegal migration, the discourse and the practice is also accompanied a longer history of violence in Assam. So there has been major instances of violence and killing of the Bengali Muslim population at different stages. And the most uh, heinous among all were the Nelli massacre of 1983, where around 3,000 Muslims were killed on a single day. This was in the heightened context of Assam movement. So while this is being discussed very recently, this was ignored for a long time, but there is now discussion happening on this particular instant in the recent past. But if you look at the history of violence, you will see a lot of instances of violence taking place even after 1990s until 2014. Although the perpetrators of violence were not the predominant, group that was producing violence. You will see that there is a shift in the perpetrators of violence. It was the Bodo militants who were engaged largely in the instances of violence in Assam in post-90s. So when we talk about Bodo's violent political movement, it is also important to understand their marginalization or backwardness as a community who has been historically neglected from the political and economic processes in the state. And Bodos were originally part of the Assam movement, but later began to detach from it because of the increasing cultural, political, and economic marginalization. And the militancy which shaped in 90s were not merely targeting the Muslim, but were also targeting Adivasis and other communities as part of their territorial politics, gaining control over the territory. But then, if you actually look at the the history, there is a longer history of violence against the Muslims, because Muslims have been the consistent target of Bodos over a period of time. And what makes Bodos Muslims a soft target? And here it is very important to understand that even though Bodos' political struggle were against the state, against their targets were quite different. This discourse of illegal migration, that many of the Muslims who lives in the BTAD region are illegal migrants, have in fact enabled them to engage in on producing violence or justifying violence, which ultimately serve the purpose of showing a political message to the state. So when I looked at the history of violence and traveled through some of these places, I have seen that there are several camps where Muslims are living in concentrated spaces. There are new and old camps. So the old camps are camps which were set up after 1990s during the Bodo militancy. But recent new camps, for example, in place like Hyderabad, where 14 Muslims were killed in 2014, like what you can see is that whenever violence happens, people are killed, fired by the militants, then many of the Muslims lose their land or their place of inhabitants, and then they are kept in relief camps. So my interest was basically to see what is happening to these relief camps. So this is very interesting. I mean, camp is a very interesting an important prism through which one can analyze the violence and marginalization, because originally this idea was introduced by Giorgio Agamben. I'm not using Agamben's own way of understanding it because it has been used in a different context. But camp in original sense is about how sovereign violence actually produce concentrated spaces where unwanted population is kept. So in our context, camps are slightly different because camps are originally set up as relief camps. But what happens to these spaces is that these spaces become kind of state of exception, that permanent state of exception, that those who are temporarily kept in camps are unable to move out of those spaces and forced to live in those places over a period of time. So my field work in Assam showed that there are people who lives in camp for last 20 years. I mean, these are originally set up for as an ad hoc arrangement just to rehabilitate people, but then state completely neglect the kind of, those who lives there. And even camps becomes the target of violence. Like, there are instances of militant attacks on the camps. So what does this camp life indicate? Like, you will see, uh, there's a kind of structural violence taking place, poverty, illiteracy, and all kinds of backwardness, permeate the life of the Muslims who lives in the camp. So the permanent nature of the camp and also establishment of new camps after violence shows that, there is a kind of, spatial concentration taking place over a period of time, and those who are kept in the camps are or reduced to the life in the camps are unable to move out of it over a period of time. So this is one kind of, the paradoxical situation that, the camps which are originally set up for relief is actually becomes a site of suffering, than the relief itself, because it doesn't have sufficient protection of the state and completely neglected over a period of time. And the people are not able to move back to their original place because of the fear. The second type of um, camp I would like to bring attention is the detention camp. So although there is a lot of discussion about the setting of a new detention camp in Assam, if you actually look at the history, you will see that there has been already 6 detention centers in Assam. These are not exclusive detention camps, but camps that are, detention centers which are associated with the jails, where the detected so-called quote-unquote illegal migrants are being housed. So, uh, as part of my research work, I have been traveling to different parts of Assam, and I happened to meet people who lived in these detention centers, because I realized that there are several Bengali-speaking people, especially Muslims, who were detected by the state over a period of time, and they were living in the detention centers of different jails like Golpara, Kokrajar, Tezpur, and so on. And and I was able to interview people who were actually released from the detention centers, because in 2019 there was a Supreme Court order that uh, you know those who are kept in the detention centers in the name of illegality cannot be kept in the detention center beyond 3 years. But there were people who were living for 7 to 8 years in those detention centers, and it was completely against, it was a complete, human right violation. So my interviews with people who got released from the detention center provide very important insights about, how they are actually being detected and what happens inside a detention center, and what is their future after the release from the detention center. So I would like to outline some of these points. And before that, it's very important to look at the legal trajectory in Assam. So the question of detection of illegal migrants and detention and possibly deportation is not something new. Like, it was in 1983, I think, after the Assam Accord, this IMDT Act, which came into prevalence. And we have to see the trajectory of this legal discourse, that IMDT was primarily, like IMDT Act says that, this was introduced basically to detect illegal migrants, but the responsibility of proving the illegality was rested upon the one who accuses than the accused. So, there were only very few people were detected over a decade or so, and this is seen as relatively ineffective in capturing the illegal migrants, according to the, political, according to the people who led the movement against the migration. But then in between, there were categories like devoters and reference cases. Like, devoters were those who were disenfranchised on the basis of the suspicion that they are illegal migrants. But the situation has, but this was not a dramatic shift in the, in the life of people who are being suspected, because those who were under the devoters category, although were denied citizenship rights in many sense, but were not, entirely entirely discriminated, or not even detected as, or detained by the state. But after the in 2005 the IMDT was struck down, and then the responsibility of proving the citizenship was rested upon the one who is accused, then the one who accuses. So then onwards, from 2005 onwards, if you look at the history, the cases of people who are detained in the detention center, then you will be able to see like how over a period of time, last 15 years or so, many people were actually caught and sent to the detention centers, and they were living in the detention centers. So the information that I gathered from the narratives of detained people, and also the judgment of foreigners tribunals and court cases, reveals that there has been serious arbitrariness in the process of detecting people, the arbitrariness of bureaucracy, contradictions, and errors in the way in which people were actually uh, uh, taken into detention centers. So, I'll give an example of one one Bengali-speaking Muslim woman who was detained in the detention center for almost 2 years and then released. Her case reveals that her husband was initially a suspected migrant under the devoters, and later he was sent a notice stating that he is under the suspicion of illegal migrant, and then he was asked to produce a document. So her husband has produced all the document and actually proved his citizenship. But in the process of furnishing the document, they found that his wife, uh, they found certain contradictions in her legacy data. And then when the judgment came on him about his innocence, the same judgment also pronounced that his wife is illegal migrant, and they immediately picked up her and kept in the detention center. So this, when I looked at the data that that they were using, and the papers that were availed, it is found that certain mistakes in the name, spelling mistakes, and also errors committed in terms of linkage with parents were taken as a proof to say that she is an illegal migrant. In fact, but then when she, after spending more than a year in the jail, she fought the case and proved that she is a citizen and came back out of the jail. So this shows that, I mean, this is an example to say that there are many actual citizens who are kept in the detention center on illegal means. In fact, the legality comes from the state than the citizens. So this is one example, but there are many cases which I have come across, people who have stayed in the detention center and came out, like because of lack of proper information. And it is, one has to understand that those who lives in the Char areas of Assam are relatively less educated and do not keep their documents properly. So, for example, absence of proper land records or absence of any other forms of legacy data actually make them fail to prove their citizenship. So, and this is evident in several cases that people are actually citizens, but then are being forcefully kept in the detention center, and some of them are able to prove their citizenship and come out of the situation. But sending them to detention center itself is a gross human right violation. That merely in the name of suspicion, then people are kept in the detention center. And also, it's also very interesting to see, like, the narratives of the people who have lived in jail, in detention centers, the kind of experience that they encounter. For example, the the suspected illegal migrants are not even given the rights of criminals, and they are housed along with the criminals in the jail, although they have a separate cell. Criminals have at least the option of parole, but the those who are suspected as illegal migrants and kept do not have even the right to come out. In a situation where they actually need to come out. For example, there are stories of like one Muslim woman, when her husband died, she was not even allowed to attend the funeral. Or there is a, and there are also serious cases of uh, difficulties that people encounter while they were living in the detention center, like negligence of their health and so on. One woman who came out of the detention center told me about when she was picked up, she was 3 months pregnant, and within few months she was aborted because of the kind of living condition there in the jail. So I'm just bringing, like, there are horrific stories of people who are living in the detention centers, which tells about how human right violation has been taking place in the detention centers. There's another case that one elder person who is now probably around 70. He was sent to jail and he lived in the detention center around 6 to 7 years. And in between, his wife committed suicide, and he came to know about it only after his release. So, and many of those whom I interviewed, I found that many are experiencing both physical and mental uh, uh, illness, in the sense that because of their long experience inside a detention center with uncertainty and fear has really affected their life. So now, once they are released, I mean, I was asking about the future about it. So it is not that once they are released, they are fully given the clean certificate, but many of them frequently goes to the police station, and some of them even fear that they may detained again and possibly deported. So there is this sense of deportation that actually honed their life. So it's also very important to see that there is no provision between India and Bangladesh to deport back to Bangladesh, because in Bangladesh that there is not even a single illegal migrant. So then it is, I believe it is more about deportability than the deportation. So deportability it serves the purpose of creating a sense that there is a huge illegal migration to the country, and even if you are not able to deport them, the constant reference to the deportation without having a provision to deport, in a sense, serves the political purpose of political organizations. It also serves the purpose of cheap labor, and there are many other kinds of consequences that comes along with it. So it was very important to recognize that many families, in fact, living in these areas have now both Indians, and after the NRC, you see that Indians and Bangladeshis, quote unquote, in their home. Or in other ways, the national borders are erected within the family, because of this whole process of detention and deportability. So this gives a very, like, interesting sense about how the family life intimates spheres. Sociality is, uh, deeply disrupted by the process of detection of illegal migrants, and its consequences has been very much there in Assam. But this is going to be much more serious in today's context. So I would like to end by saying that while NRC and CI is seen as something which shift the political context of the country, where Muslims are being increasingly targeted in the current scenario. There is already a history in Assam from which we need to consider what has happened in Assam for past 15-20 years, and how, what lesson can we learn from the history of violence and discrimination in the Assam state. I think I will stop here and take up questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Hassan, are you there? Hassan?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So there are a lot of other scholars are here. Those who would like to ask questions and all. So there, feel free to discuss and raise your comments, questions, whatever it is. Hassan, please moderate it, right?
Yes, if you have any question, please write on the chat box, or you can unmute your microphone and you can ask.
I could see Vikas Bhai, Aparajita, yes, Zulfikar. If you have any issues, like I know you are engaged with the debate. If you have any issues, please do ask. Feel free to ask questions to Dr. Salah.
Hello, good evening, sir. Here Zulfikar here from Jadavpur University. I would like to ask Dr. Salah that what do you think? Do you think so that the current discourse on NRC, where it is going to be stopped? I mean, will it have any political implications in future?
Yeah, can I take up a few questions or directly answer?
As you wish, you can take few questions, or you want to answer it right now. You can do that as well.
Maybe I can take a couple of questions. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yes, Rosda, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Salah, I just wanted a little bit of clarification. The citizenship clauses of Assam that you're talking about right now are going to be, they have their own concept of, register of citizens. But if you're found to be a non-Assamese person of Indian origin, how is that taking away your citizenship and not your domicile status? Technically your domicile should be the one which should be stripped, not your citizenship. And the second thing which I wanted to ask was, does it affect the like Jammu Kashmir has this very specific clause of 35A which is now being stripped, but owning property, owning any kind of holding in Assam, would you be able to give me a little bit of clarity on that? Because if that is the kind of stakes we're talking about, then of course we have a really bloody battle at hand.
Okay. So let me answer the first question on the NRC. I think we need to learn a lot from the NRC that is already being implemented from Assam, in Assam. In fact, the whole process of conducting this exercise and publishing a list of this sort. In fact, there is already a lot of discussion happened about it, and people have shown that how this has been a flawed exercise in many sense, like what kind of arbitrariness. In fact, we need to understand the arbitrariness of bureaucracy, or the way in which bureaucracy functions in our country, because there are a lot of studies on migration, not just in Indian context, but in other places also, that although rules say something, there is something official and something real. So the official says that these are the procedures that has been followed, this is what you have to show, and so on. But then when you look at the actual practices and when you talk to people, then you realize that the mistakes that are being done in the process of doing it. Secondly, a very straightforward point is that, as I mentioned in the talk also, that many people do not hold the documents not because they are illegal migrants. They do not hold it because there was no practice of keeping the records. And many of the instances from my fieldwork actually shows that there were many errors committed in terms of the documents that they have furnished, mainly because of the ignorance, mainly because of lack of understanding about it, because people hardly even read. So and also those who were detained, I mean, even before NRC, when they wanted to fight it back, they did not know how to do legally fight it because they have no access, no capital to access to competent lawyers. And even the lawyers who have helped them, it is found that many of them were not, capable to help them, because many lawyers are also not really aware about the entire process, because it need to have money to, fight the legal battle. So it's far more easier for the state to identify people as illegal migrant, because if you want to find the loopholes in the documents, or if you want to have loopholes in the whole process, it is far more easier, than easier for the state. So talking about the future, elsewhere in the country now there is increasing resistance to NRC in other parts of the country, and which is being now opposed, and it is very difficult to predict that what is going to happen. But also, I mean, when we say that we need to learn from NRC in Assam, the center has also learned a lesson that this could be a good political tool for the mobilization for their political interest. So the second question about the situation of non-Assamese community, and this is precisely the point that you know uh, what becomes the basis of identifying somebody as illegal migrants. It is the identity of the other as being part of a particular religious community plays an important role. Because if you look at the history, the migration is not only from one community, like there were Bengali Hindus were also migrating in huge since long. But if you actually look at I mean, at least in the case of detention, and I'm not aware about the composition of population in the NRC final list, whether it's been out or not. But in the detention centers, I have seen 99% of people whom I interviewed were from the Muslim community. So this religious factor has been playing an important role. So let me give one interesting field example. One Bengali, she is not actually Bengali speaking Muslim, one Muslim woman was identified as a devoter, and later she proved that she is not a devoter. The reason for identifying her as a devoter was that she is actually originally a Bodo woman, but she converted to Islam as, she was, a Muslim man married her, so, and changed her name. So then she was figured in the devoter list, and then she was figured in the list because her name actually played a role in figuring in that, and then later she's actually a Bodo woman, and then proved her citizenship. So we need to see that how religious factors plays out in the whole process of detection and so on. Secondly, regarding, I think the second question was about the land. I mean, I don't think this situation is comparable to the, Kashmir or elsewhere, because it's not about holding the land and so on. It's about people who lives in the region who are identified as, illegal migrants or called as illegal migrants, and, putting them in the detention center.
Okay, now we have another question.
Okay.
This is from Anamika Roy, and she's asking, I wanted to know, is it permissible to take interviews of the people living in detention camp? Do they allow us to visit the camps for research purpose? If you would like to.
Okay, so let me clarify that I didn't interview these people in the detention center. In fact, I interviewed people who got released from the detention center after staying for years. Like there were people who stayed for 6-7 years. There were people who stayed for a couple of years. So some of them were released uh, because not because they were able to prove the citizenship, but because there was a Supreme Court order which ensures uh, that nobody can be detained in the name of illegal migration in a detention center more than 3 years. There is no provision to keep them forever in the detention center, because also there is no provision to deport them back to Bangladesh. Secondly, I also interviewed people who went to detention center but proved their citizenship after legal battle and came back to their home. So they typically proved that they are citizens after fighting it legally. So I have interviewed all of them in their house, not actually in the detention centers. And I don't think it's possible to go to detention center and interview, but I'm aware that certain human rights groups have probably moved to did that, but I have not gone to the jail. Although I tried, I did not succeed in getting the permission to do that.
Okay, sir. So the next question that we have is, related to the one that you have just answered. This is from Shubho Sengupta, and he is asking the same question. He's saying that, hi, the same question as Anamika. How did you manage to interview the detainees? And he is asking, are there any human rights lawyers working on this? I mean, you have just answered this, but yet would want to elaborate a bit on this.
Yes. There are human rights lawyers. There are several activists who are also working. In fact, my understanding is that this Supreme Court order came after somebody filed case, because there were many people who were living for more than 7-8 years in the detention center. Because once you are in once you put them in the detention center, there is no provision to deport. Deportation, this is why I call it as deportability. There is no deportation, but there is only deportability. That, you constantly propagate that people will be deported, but there is no provision to deport. So, but there is also no provision to keep them forever in the detention center. So, therefore, but there are, to answer the question, I'm aware that there are, human rights activists and lawyers who have been fighting for the cause of the, poor Muslims, and also some Hindus who were kept in the detention centers. So, but it's very important to see, look at the case of the people who have proven their citizenship hours after spending several years in the jail, how their everyday life, how their life has been obstructed by this whole process. And the kind of human rights violation has taken place in the name of illegality. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. Now this is a question from one of our base members, and he writes, do you think de-voter is the first stage of NRC? Is it a matter of fear? What would you?
Yeah, to answer this, de-voter is not we need not to see NRC and de-voter as connected. It was something typical to Assam, because de-voter as a category came into existence after this resentment of the political organization in Assam, after IMDT, because it is seen as ineffective in capturing illegal migrants, and there were a lot of political protests. And in response to that, there is a huge list of people who were called as de-voters came into existence. And de-voter is not, as such, this is not something which is going to happen in other parts of the country. I don't think, because this was a solution offered by the state at a particular historical point in Assam. But then de-voters have, later became illegal migrants, or people were picked up from this list. But not everyone. That is why I call this also as very arbitrary. Certain de-voters were then sent the notice by the state, and they were asked to represent their case, and in the foreigners tribunal, and then if they fail to prove, then they are being detained. So devoter is something very specific to Assam context, and it is not close. It is not like a it's not possible to see an immediate connection between these two. Like a devoter as a first stage of NRC is not the correct way of thinking about it. This was a specific kind of situation in a particular, like in late 90s in Assam, but it still works, and it really affected a lot of people, and some of them were even detained in the detention center.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. Now we have a question from Musvi Rahman, and he's asking, do you think government was responsible for the labor migration in Assam?
Okay. It's a bit difficult question to ask in the sense that labor migration, in fact, all of these were, in a sense, labor migration from present-day Bangladesh to the present-day Assam region, but since the early colonial time. So there has been movement of people across the borders, and there were no sharp borders drawn at that period of time. So certainly they were encouraged to settle in the Brahmaputra Valley under the condition of demand for labor, agricultural practices, and so on. So 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 there is a long history of it. Like people have been moving across the boundaries before the formation of the nation state itself, and colonialism encouraged this movement of labor across the boundary. So it plays an important factor, and I think we also need to see like how the factor of labor plays even in today's politics. For example, to what extent these the migrant labor is being exploited, because this whole discourse also has certain economic impact in terms of cheap labor, availability of labor, and so on. So state has always been in essence encouraging the movement of people across the borders, but the problem is that there is a paradoxical situation that the same state also try to kind of come up with the restrictive measures when it comes to the uh, when there are political agitations and so on. So it's a very paradoxical situation as far as I understood. Thank you.
Okay, sir. So I think we have another question from Team Dreamer. Maybe he would want to ask the question by himself. So please unmute yourself, Team Dreamer, and you can ask the question.
Hello, Salah. Very interesting discussion. My question is the central point as put forward by Assamese xenophobic project is that certain segment of population is not the sons of the soil, that they are not part of the evolutionary fabric of the Assamese society, and they were not part of the initial formation of Assamese identity, and that's why they don't have claim to the Assamese culture and Assamese larger Assamese identity as such. In that case, the Bengalis who are in Assam, they and those who don't speak Assamese at all, they want to exclude them completely. And if they are Muslim, then they will be termed as Bangladesian termites and whatnot. So this conflict of identity versus being born in a land. Normally today, most of the countries and states all around the world define that if you are born in a land, you are part of that land, and you have claim to that identity. But the way Assamese project is trying to define this is you have to be, your four ancestors has to be part of that formation of that identity, otherwise you are excluded. So how do you see that debate forward, and what the Bengali population of Assam can resolve this identity crisis?
Yeah, I completely agree with your point, and I think you have also partly answered the question in the sense that, you know, see, the issue is it is not correct that the Bengali-speaking Muslims were always retaining their distinctive identity, but they were actually assimilated in although the word assimilation is also a problem, but they were actually, in fact, many of the scholars and even uh, Muslims would claim that they were actually practicing the Assamese, some of the Assamese cultural, following the Assamese cultural practices, or even language has been at a particular point of time when it was needed, then shifting to the Assamese language. So there were always negotiation taking place, between the dominant linguistic community and the, migrant community, or those who have migrated, at different phases in the history. But the problem comes, especially the issue of targeting a particular population. And I think there we need to understand that although the movement emerges as a subnationalist uh, movement against the outsiders and foreigners and so on, the real issue is that where and how it becomes communal in character over a period of time. How, say, for example, Hindu nationalist projects comes into play at various junctures. So, so it is always been said by even scholars that it is the backwardness, it is the encroachment of land, it is the hijacking of labor space in terms and so on. These were all seen as, or furnishing the documents through fraudulent means and so on. These were the reasons given by, both scholars and also the political leaders. But then the fact is that when you pitch it against the indigenous population versus the illegal migrant, what is not addressed sufficiently in such a discourse is that this turns into communal. This turns into communal means the political organization from outside did influence at all crucial junctures, and that is why we have history of Nelly massacre. That is why we have the continuing history of targeting the Muslims by the militant groups and so on. And also it is important to see that when it becomes more kind of rigid rigid system of detecting people, there also the religious factors come into play. So I think the question of migration in Assam cannot be disentangled entirely from the national question of Muslim, or the national Muslim question. And so we need to see both the migrant and the Muslim identity when we look at the way in which things plays out in the region.
Okay, so the next question that we have is, what is the relationship between free labor system and NRC? Can we see some issue in China?
Free labor system
and NRC.
I'm not very sure about the connection, but I was trying to connect with the labor, but this is something one has to study empirically. But see, there is always a paradox when you say is that there is illegal migration, people moving across the border illegally and coming and taking the resources. There has always been also the utilization of the labor. There has been economic transaction taking place. In fact, state has been promoting it, the political leaders has been promoting it, or other economic forces has been playing an important role in perpetuating, in promoting the labor force of the migrant people. So, and this is not something typical to Assam context, but elsewhere in the world, there has been studies which talks about how movement across borders has been encouraged in terms of the flow of the labor, because of the vested economic interest. But in this instance, we can see that how the cheap labor of the of particular people who belongs to certain communities are being exploited increasingly, not just in Assam but in other places too. But then maybe I'm not very sure, but then it may be very useful also to see like how these constant threat of being possibility of deported, or possibility of detained, or possibility of being detected, in a sense also helps the economic forces to retain the cheap labor, because this has already been happening in many places. So even if there is some illegality working out, illegality is not something that comes only from the bottom, that people just cross and live illegally, but this has been also in a sense retained by the existing structures and forces.
Okay, thank you so much. I don't think we have any more questions. So if anybody would want to ask a question, they can ask. I don't think we have any more questions. So Hassan Bhai, would you want to take over from here?
Yes. So I request Professor Nargis Ahmed. She is a professor, a Department of Nursing, Alia University. So I'd request Professor Nargis Ahmed to deliver the formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, Hassan Bhai. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, namaskar, and good evening to all of you present here, our guests, delegates, and all BASE members. At first, I must thank BASE for providing me the opportunity to deliver vote of thanks today. On behalf of BASE, Bengali Academia for Social Empowerment, I convey my sincere and cordial thanks to our today's speaker, Dr. Salah Punathil, Assistant Professor, University of Hyderabad, and Post-Doctoral Fellow, Max Planck Institute, for the study of religious and ethnic diversity, Göttingen, Germany, to talk on the topic, the crisis of citizenship in contemporary India. Sir, it was indeed a very important and informative lecture. Thank you so much for your kind deliberation today in this online lecture. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure interacting with all, and thanks a lot to organizers and also all the participants who came and joined for this session. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir. I must thank BASE President, Vice President, GS, and all members, especially the team who are working hard continuously for BASE lecture series happening successfully. Last but not the least, I must convey my thanks and appreciate our audience who have constantly shown their interest in BASE lectures, which is a matter of motivation and encouragement for BASE. So thank you all once again. Have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Salah bhai.
Abdul Bhai, thank you.